What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Today's episode looks at why deliberative mini-publics are popular with politicians, academics and democracy advocates. First up is Professor Graham Smith. Graham is a Professor of Politics in the Centre for the Study of Democracy in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster in London. He has written extensively on democratic innovations, as well as recently designing and conducting an experiment comparing two citizens' assemblies, looking at government devolution in the UK. More on that in a later episode. I asked Graham what he thought attracted politicians to deliberative mini-publics.
So there are a number of different reasons why decision makers use deliberative mini-publics. There are occasionally decision makers who are absolutely committed to the idea of mini-publics in the sense that they recognise that they're going to give them an input in decision making, which is a rare type of input, one which gives them the judgments of extremely inclusive group of citizens and a kind of a recommendation, if you like, unlike other types of recommendations. We also should recognise that some decision makers use mini-publics strategically to deal with difficult political decisions that they're not willing or able to deal with themselves. I guess the classic there is the British Columbia Citizens' Assembly, in which which was established because there was a recognition amongst political decision makers that they needed a new electoral system, but they couldn't agree amongst themselves what that electoral system should be. And so rather than endlessly fighting, they handed that incredibly contentious decision process over to citizens. So I think sometimes politicians use mini-publics when they can't see a way out themselves. Now, that may actually in some ways be a good way of building up the standing and status of participatory processes, is to show that it can deal with these sort of complex political decisions that political decision makers and politicians often don't want to get involved in. So I think there are different reasons. As I say, there is a small cadre of political leaders who are enlightened in relationship to participatory processes, but I think for most it's they're often more forced to the table. It's a kind of they're not necessarily committed to participatory processes, but they come to learn through doing.
And certainly in my research, preliminary research I'm doing for my PhD, the political elites that I'm talking to, there does appear to be a certain sense of instrumentalism in their decision making, and everybody agrees that the type of issues that you put to deliberative mini-publics are ones that are complex and that are difficult for politicians to make an easy call on, if you like. So yeah, it's sort of a bit of both in a way.
And I think that what's happening in our contemporary democracies is the types of issues that politicians are facing. Representative systems weren't necessarily designed to deal with. I mean, the sheer complexity, the sheer scale of the kinds of problems in urban problems in relation to urban design, issues around climate change, etc. Our representative structures are not well designed for those. So it's not a surprise very often that we see political leaders scrabbling around trying to find other ways of doing things, particularly given that they're not a particularly trusted breed at the moment.
I asked a similar question of Professor Janette Hartz-Karp from the Sustainability Policy Unit at Curtin University in Western Australia. As well as undertaking research in the area of democratic innovations, Janette led numerous large, innovative deliberative processes as a community engagement consultant to the then Western Australian Minister for Planning and Infrastructure. Here's what Janette had to say about why deliberative mini-publics are so popular at the moment.
I think we've had enough successes now to show that they work. I think we've had some very iconic successes, and for example, Carolyn Luckensmeyer work after 9/11 with 5,000 people there, and then the citizens' juries that Ned Crosby put in place, and then the work that they've done on constitutional work in Europe, and we've been leading the way as well, and it seems to be taking time. But I really think it's a matter of, in a way, it sounds strange, but in a way it creates opportunities for us that many of our democracies are in such disrepute, and people feel so little allegiance to any political party, and they don't feel like they have a say, and so they feel mistrustful of politicians and political institutions. So this is an alternative. They can see that this is just a microcosm of the population trying to talk about an issue that matters to them. They can see that they end in a result, and that this result isn't being pushed because it's very transparent by any particular vested interests. And I also think we're starting to build up enough people that are really having the experience of deliberation and be interested more in becoming responsible citizens, or having more efficacy as citizens, which inevitably happens. In Australia, we've begun to find that it helps elected representatives be re-elected. So it's even a carrot for, elected representatives. So I think it's because we've now got enough successes under our belt to show you've got a tricky problem, especially if it's one that you don't have an easy answer to, then you're a whole lot better off probably sharing the pain, if there is any, as well as the problem solving, as well as the response, than you are in trying to come up with a lose-lose sort of answer that's really not going to get implemented anyway. Or if it does, as I said, if it does get implemented, it would be lose-lose, or just an answer that at least some people are going to be angry at. So, we're on a wave. The worry is that it doesn't just sort of die down to an ebb, but rather it picks up and becomes an ever bigger wave.
I also spoke with Luca Belgiorno-Nettis, the founder of the newDemocracy Foundation. The newDemocracy Foundation is an independent, non-partisan research organisation aiming to identify improvements to our democratic process with a focus on promoting deliberative mini-publics as a key democratic reform. I asked Luca about why he set up the newDemocracy Foundation and why deliberative mini-publics are such a key element of their work.
It was as much out of exasperation, having dealt with politicians in various levels of government, whether it be federal or state here in Australia, and also some experience overseas because I'd lived in Malaysia for 7 years, and I'd seen how difficult the political situation was in Malaysia. But it was as much the Australian situation in that I found, having been invited to, whether it was the campaign fundraising events of the various political parties or being involved in discussions around infrastructure projects with governments, I found that what was happening, in my view, was suboptimal. And I probably need to explain what I mean by that, suboptimal. So I would see the campaign fundraising events as being not much more than spruiking salesmanship events where the politicians were all trying to impress themselves upon businessmen, of course, because they were the people who were being lobbied to fund these campaigns. And I just saw them as being competent salesmen, but not particularly good statesmen in a sense. So that prompted me to think about, well, how could politics be done differently, or how could political representation be done differently? And then at the same time, being involved in a family infrastructure business where we were doing quite big infrastructure projects for governments of various jurisdictions, I would find on occasions what seemed to be regarded as good projects were being shelved for questions of political expediency, whether it was because the particular projects envisaged were in electorates that were not seen to be of use to the powers that be, the politicians that were in power, so they were shelved because they had no particular advantage electorally as such. So I thought that was a that was a failing of democracy as currently being done. Well, I was always keen to have a dialogue with politicians and people interested in this particular subject, political reform. Not that very many politicians are interested in political reform because, they actually, like most people, don't understand what political reform means apart from extending voting, extending parliamentary terms, or reducing the voting age, or these sort of aspects of political reform. I saw it in a much more systemic way. I saw it as being how to improve the deliberative capacity of our parliaments. And so I invited the likes of ex-politicians, and I was fortunate to attract the likes of Fred Chaney from the Liberal Party and then John Button from the Labor Party. And so I was always keen to have this non-partisan or bipartisan character to this foundation. And then had the discussions with my colleagues, working colleagues, and at the time that was Cathy Jones principally. And then we were introduced to Professor Lynn Carson, and in that context we started to build out some understanding. As we didn't really understand what we were doing until we started to speak to Professor Carson about deliberative democracy as, in fact, a new way of considering how a democracy could be done.
Why, of all the different democratic reforms and innovations that you could be promoting, why you chose deliberative mini-publics to be the key focus of your work?
In a sense, what was so compelling about the question of deliberative mini-publics was, firstly, and this is not necessarily totally appreciated by deliberative Democrats around the world, but I saw it as being the key element of deliberative democracy, and that is the representative element of it, which we saw as being critically needing to be that of random recruitment, of sortition. So that seemed to be so compelling. That jury model, the only principal argument that is usually levied against the jury model is that the particular jury has limited competence for the question at hand. And then what we find to address that critique is that once you give the jury, the members, the opportunity to deliberate together with all the various presentations, pros, cons, whatever, they come to reasonable decisions. And this was kind of the watershed for me, in the sense that I hadn't really, you have to actually experience that to really believe it, because most people have trouble believing that unless you experience it.
In Canada, MASS LBP is a consultancy focused on democratic innovation and public strategy. MASS has conducted 25 major reference panels, citizens' assemblies and commissions for government involving more than 1,000 Canadians. With so much experience, I asked Peter MacLeod, the principal and founder of MASS LBP, what he thought attracted decision makers to these type of approaches to engaging citizens.
There are a number of factors that are all coming into play. I think some of it is generational, and I think a new generation of political leadership just has a different sensibility about what the appropriate relationship between citizens and government might look like, and that's going to be a more deliberative relationship. I think there's an appreciation on the part of many in government that the complexity of the files themselves and the need to create what is admittedly a contentious term, social license, is real, and that you need higher fidelity processes, those that can be more granular and precise and explore the trade-offs inherent in a lot of policy choices become necessary. I think there's also just widespread frustration with the standard ways of doing business and their limits. All of the stuff that we so often hear in this space about, already knowing what people are going to say before they come into the room, because they're often stakeholders who are very well known to government. And, I think this is a great time to be working in this field, so long as we're cautious not to overpromise. And I think it's actually a hazard amongst a lot of people who can sometimes, either intentionally or inadvertently, convey the sense that these processes are more democratic, more legitimate, and certainly more progressive than the representative institutions that I think properly they're intended to complement. So we can feel good about growing demand, but we still have to stay humble and be mindful of the limits of this work as well. And we shouldn't be surprised that there is a sort of latent skepticism about the capacity of people to play a more informed role. After all, their typical encounters with the quote-unquote public are often highly dysfunctional or in some ways, unsatisfying. And so the promise that bringing together a group of randomly selected people who can take such care in investigating a public issue and commenting on it with great sophistication, that comes as that's counter to most people's experience. And I think one of the responsibilities of people working in this space is to show, not tell. Because that seems to be the best proof that something different is possible. Which itself is, and I think it's important that that there's room in our societies for democratic innovation. That means there's also going to be room for democratic failures. And so long as we come back, I guess, to what the overarching purpose of this work is, which for me is kind of twofold. One, it's about extending the opportunity to more people, but it's also about changing the culture of our democracy and perhaps putting less emphasis on the winner-take-all majoritarian hyper-partisan atmosphere that is quite pervasive, and instead creating a culture of learning that is really about finding a more empathic way of relating to one another. And I think we can create these spaces with real intention. I'm not sure that they need to supplant or replace some of our existing democratic infrastructure, however, in order to do so.
And finally, here is the perspective of Emily Jenke from Democracy Co., a consultancy who facilitates deliberative mini-publics for government and businesses. Emily is currently leading a team of facilitators for one of the world's largest deliberative mini-publics, a 350-person citizens' jury, considering the future of nuclear waste in South Australia. I asked Emily whether clients were approaching her asking for deliberative mini-publics or whether she was recommending them.
More often than not, at the moment, we're actually getting clients come to us. As I said before, they're generally government, although we've just been doing some work in the private sector as well. And the common thread is that they're faced with a problem that is complex in nature, and generally there are a whole bunch of politics around it. There might be really proper politics around it, or I suppose tension and media interest around the topics. So generally they come to us and say, we've got a problem and we'd like to do something deliberative, but they often don't know what that something is. So we then create it. So we might choose to run a citizens' jury, or we might run a deliberative panel, or we might run a participative budgeting approach. It really it depends on I suppose the question that's being put to us.
In the next episode of Real Democracy Now, a podcast, I'll be talking to a range of people from around the world who design and run deliberative mini-publics to get a picture of the diversity of approaches being taken to engage randomly selected everyday people in deliberation. I hope you'll join me for that discussion. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now. You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.